I'd like to talk today about informing my teaching through reflections on successful mobile application language learning. So I'm going to talk about what I have learned during these challenging times of COVID-19 in terms of my own use and my own thinking about language learning apps. So my mobile apps, I'm talking about phone-based and tablet-based apps, because quite clearly, a lot of us have had a chance to reflect on our teaching and learning because of COVID-19, which has changed so many things. This is no longer a case where we are in the classroom with all the lovely visual clues, and we're no longer up front being in control of the process. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about the background and then talk about what I have learned as a learner using phone apps. So we're really in a time where we're not in our usual workplaces. So here I am, Professor Stephen Hall at Sunway University, but I'm not, of course. I'm sitting in my own house. And we're really in a time of new pushed output. We had little choice but to be pushed into new learning as the site of learning changed to being online and on screen. And one of the big challenges for me has been managing the interaction, creating interactivity. It is not easy. And we've also had to work with the use of visuals. And it was during this time of much pushed learning, much pushed change, that I reflected on what I could learn and was learning by using phone apps. And in my case, it was for Korean, so I could talk to my grandson more fully, and French, which interests me. Now, we're in a time then, while everybody's at home, that in fact mobile assisted language learning is growing internationally. You'll see the source there from an article which lists the number of users of mobile assisted language learning, including the speaker, Stephen Hall. So we have just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apps named, but look at the numbers. And at the same time as we are struggling with keeping our learners' attention, remember that around the world, millions are learning languages through apps. So this mobile assisted language learning, could we perhaps learn from it in terms of our own design, our own teaching, and our own learning? And that's what I'm going to suggest today. I'm going to suggest there's some principles that we can apply in our own teaching and learning from what I've learned. Well, motivation through spaced significant repetition rewards and a sense of achievement. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Move my head a little bit, say motivated by spaced significant repetition rewards and a sense of achievement. And these are all things that are critical to a successful phone app and phone app design. I go right back to the work of my professor, Paul Nation, who talks about spaced significant repetition. So the language learning apps I use, in my case, the Duolingo and Memrise, they always try and keep you up to date with doing something every day, because language learning is a bit like a muscle, as I will show later. It's like a muscle in that if you don't use it, you lose it. And I've had language loss with some of my other languages because I've got no one to speak Solomon Islands Pidgin with, for example. So the spaced and daily repetition is an important principle of how phone apps are designed. And for me, what this means when I'm working with my learners, it means saying to them, set a workable target that you have. In other words, bite-sized chunks of achievement, and that's the specialty of phone apps. Small chunks, not too much, observable, and building. But of course, it's all a big question of what are we going to learn when we are learning a new language. And what's become very important when you look at the designs, ta-da, an idea. When you look at the designs, the app designers choose important functions for the grammar. Things you really need to do, like introducing yourself, saying where you're from, talking about your interests, the national Malaysian sport of food. And really what happens in these phone apps, they're simple and form to start with. So when they're designing the apps, they will choose known vocabulary. So for example, you can probably work out in the Korean word for chizu is easy to learn because it's close to cheese. And when they're choosing the vocabulary, they also look at frequent vocabulary with high usability. So this, however, to get this, to learn the necessary vocab and grammar, and let's face it, phone apps are strong on vocab and grammar, but we sometimes forget that without vocabulary, you can't grow in a language. It's critical. And we really need repetition in varied contexts and through varied ways of building the memory traces. So some of the tasks I noticed that are being used in the phone apps include matching tasks, matching the picture with the vocabulary, rearranging the letters so that you get the vocabulary items, so you pay attention to the form. Yeah, putting it in different sentence patterns so that you realize that the set vocabulary item can be applied in different ways. And then later on, it appears in another form. So you may have the present tense, and in the next lesson, there it is in the past. So this varied context is very important, and that includes all the skills. So the phone apps use all the skills as they build the acquiring of meaning from simple to complex, providing for output. So maybe when we think about our face-to-face teaching, sometimes we're providing all the input, but really the key lies in maximizing the use of language by learners through important output and also through conversation. So some of these apps include a section where you can talk to the speaker of the language, because it becomes clear that to learn a language, you also need to socialize in it. And by socializing, I mean, we need to know that I can interact in this language, and that brings a real sense of achievement. And that's a difficulty sometimes here in Malaysia with our learners, providing for interaction and socializing in English language. So, I mean, it's a safe environment when you're online and you're with a phone app because you're not going to lose face. So maybe the key lies in teaching for me in how I use the rooms in the different platforms. So providing the rooms in Zoom and using those rooms that you have where you can send the learners away to talk to each other. And then if you're roving through the rooms, you find they're going to be talking a lot more than talking to you when you are also on screen. So socializing, and the socializing happens as well within the phone apps. What's also really, really interesting for me about these phone apps and why they work so well is that you know where you're going. In small chunk-sized bits of learning, you are rewarded. Yes, I got my lingot, or I got up the table. Yep, so gamification in phone apps provides a sense of achievement. There's a bit of a competitive element too, and everybody likes a bit of a game. So are we in our teaching thinking about specific praise for small chunks of learning? And I don't just mean you're very good, you did well. Naming the area of the achievement. And I wrote about this recently with a colleague, George Jacobs, where we talk about the need to praise in a specific way. just like I can see my rewards when I'm working with the phone app. So it's a sense of the inner reward and also the community reward. In the phone app, that comes from the tables that you have. You know, you are now at the gold status. And all of our game-loving teenage boys, they know all about this kind of reward structure. In teaching, I'm not saying we go and give dinosaur stamps to everybody, but do we actually praise the specific of a small piece of learning, because it's all tiny incremental steps when we are working at acquiring a language. And the phone apps are all skills. So now we have to change what we're doing, don't we? But we need to keep emphasizing collaboration. And that's where things like Google Docs are useful, where we can develop collaborative structures, where learners can work together on projects and not just be dependent on us as the talking head like I'm doing now. And of course, the thing about phone apps that is really, really exciting is that you can learn anytime the feeling strikes. And now this is one thing that we may see once we return to the old normal, that maybe one thing we can learn from blended learning is, are we providing the online resources where learners can go back and revisit? Have we established a storage capacity where they can go and see a particular learning session again and relearn it? Because everybody learns at different rates, as you know, in any class. And of course, what's good about the phone apps is they have the artificial intelligence, which says, where have you been for the last week? And I bet you've forgotten things. And of course we have. So again, we do need to think about the fact that we should look at what is happening with spaced, significant repetition and go back to items. The work of people like Paul Nation and Averil Coxhead from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, fabulous university, where of course I studied, haha. Yeah, the thing about their work is they make the point that to get a vocab item, to get a sentence pattern inside this little computer, we need to meet the item at least 5, possibly 7 times in different contexts. Otherwise, we're always going to have that problem that every teacher has. Oh, but I taught you that. But it doesn't mean the learner learned it. And we forget. So, you know, we seem to also have forgotten about the idea of a spiraling curriculum, but it should spiral up and down and go back to the things that were learned earlier to see whether they have been part of the learner's uptake, part of what's gone in there. So I thought I'd give you a picture of a son of a friend of mine and say that all of this, the phone apps and our teaching and learning, we sometimes forget that language learning is a bit like a muscle. So here is Josh when he was a swimmer. Now it's all to do with practice, yeah? And perhaps for me, from the phone apps, I've also learned that as teachers, we too are learners. When the write and speak, the mistakes help us learn. Yeah, got that? And for me, we need to discover our own way of learning and realize that our learners may have different ways of learning, but what works for us is going to be an important part of how we decide to organize learning, but it may not be the best way. For example, I need to physically write down new vocabulary when I'm learning it. Maybe our learners need to type it. Some people need to hear it. So of course the online dictionaries are very good like that. You can hear whether it's American or it's British. And playing with language, I think, is important, to play with the language. And that, of course, is what a phone app does that maybe we don't do enough of in the classroom. It makes it fun as we play with the language. So back to my picture. Remember the early one of Josh? So he became Mr. Universe. And I'm not advocating that everybody does this. I certainly don't. And he did it because of practice, practice, and practice, and spaced significant repetition. He is multilingual, by the way, but here he's obviously something else because he won the Mr. Universe competition, and he did it by repetition and practice and a goal. So I have my goals when I use the phone apps. I also have an app which will record my pronunciation avec français, and it will tell me whether my pronunciation is going off. And I think that's one of the tools that we should continue to use when we go back to more blended learning and some face-to-face. The capacity of the phone to record our own pronunciation. The capacity of the phone to record our own pronunciation. And I think the other thing that's very interesting that we can be doing with using the phone, and now I'm going to talk about, you can not totally ignore that the phone is really good for learning about word stress and meaning stress. The other thing I learned from the phone apps is something I know from my own writing anyway, that writing always involves correcting, and that language learning is like a muscle. And that when I am learning on the phone apps, there's a key principle which I really do think I need to apply when I'm teaching myself, and that is to learn from others. And especially with this pandemic, many of our students are really switched on online, and they can be our teachers. So we should celebrate the collaboration and the mutual learning. So what do we do when we come to both using phone apps and linking it and reflecting on phone apps? I go back to some principles here from a former teacher of mine. I work out what my needs are and learn what is most useful. And maybe we need to get our learners in classrooms to do this, to articulate, well, what are you learning for and where do you want to go? And then balance that learning across the 4 strands. Now, by the 4 strands, I don't just mean reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but I'm talking about you've got to look at accuracy of the form. You've got to look at accuracy of the usage. You have to look at fluency and just developing fluency and having fun with it. So this is where the breakout rooms are really important online, yeah, developing the fluency. And you've got to look at the productive use in many different contexts and many ways. But the learners need to know, hey, where am I going with this? Why am I learning the language? What do I want to get out of it? And hopefully it's more than passing SPM. Where are we going in the future? Well, the pace of mobile assisted language learning could well outpace teacher-fronted normalcy as blended learning grows. Let me unpack that. When people are motivated, they will learn, and they've had the time to learn all kinds of things while they're stuck at home with our COVID-19. But maybe they also learn in mobile assisted language learning because it's in bite-sized chunks, it's spaced, it's the significant vocabulary that's needed, vocabulary such as you see in the academic word list for universities, in the word lists coming out of Victoria University of Wellington. Yeah, it's important words, frequent words. So Mel uses that. And as blended learning grows, I think we're not going to be able to ignore the power of the phone and the consideration of its role in the classroom. You may say, no, 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 it'll never happen. But as I've said in other presentations, and it's worth repeating, nobody's arguing about the inkwell anymore. They then went on to argue about the fountain pen, saying that you had to use it, you couldn't use a biro or a big pen or a ballpoint pen. Now we are looking at the fact that keyboard skills are increasingly important, neglected. Typing skills are important, neglected. It's changing. And just look at the millions of people that are learning from mobile assisted language learning. For mobile assisted language learning, I reflect on it as having principles which I could learn from to apply in my face-to-face teaching. Reward small chunks of learning, make it fun, space out the key items, pick the significant grammar and the vocabulary, and enjoy the learning and have fun. Because if we reflect on our own learning as educators, we will also model reflection on learning for our students in this time where we are going to see mobile learning stay and grow. Thank you for listening. I'm Prof. Stephen Hall. You can find more and some academic writing related to this presentation on my website at stephenjhall.com. Have a great conference and stay well.